Hello, everyone. My name's Alicia Johnson. I'm a licensed therapist, and today I'm doing something a little different from my social media, blog, podcasting stuff, and I'm going to be doing a book review. Today, we're going to be talking about the book Come As You Are by Dr. Emily Nagoski. This is not like a sponsored or paid for thing. This is just something that I'm combining my multiple loves for. I love reading. I read all the time. It helps with my own mental health as well as a creative and passion-fueled, value-driven thing in my work. I also love bringing awareness and resources for people that are accessible as well as accurate. So there's so much noise out there. I want to be able to help folks find accurate, helpful information. And so I also just like really like talking and my social media, there's reels and TikToks are like 10 seconds or 60 seconds. And I'm like, I got lots to say. So I hope this is going to be helpful for you. If you have book suggestions, let me know. I've got a few already lined up, but this one I'm so excited to start with. So as a reminder, this was not like paid for or sponsored. I bought this myself and I'm just sharing my own thoughts about it. So I wanted to start by sharing a little bit about just a summary of what it is. So I'm not going to give any spoilers for it. So it's definitely something that I think like you should read on your own. But just as a reminder, the book is called Come As You Are, The Surprising New Science That Will Transform Your Sex Life by Dr. Emily Nagoski. This is my second book that I've read from her, so I kind of knew already that I was going to like her writing style and the way that she talks about things, a lot of her values. So it was really nice. I have a lot of colleagues and friends who have read this book who are like, Alicia, you need to read this book. And surprisingly, I'm an LMFT by trade. I've taken sexuality courses in school, but this I learned more about things than my expensive education taught me. So I really think everyone should read this. Not just if you are a woman, but just if everyone should read this. What I really like about it is, while it's complicated stuff, like she talks about research and evidence-based things and these different cycles and complex terms, she does it in a way where it's like the everyday person can understand it. And I think that is one of the most impressive skills people can have is when they can take these complicated things and then be able to describe it where like everyone can be engaged in it. So even though I have some training and education, it wasn't so like tuned down that it wasn't like interesting for me, but it was still something where if you've never taken a graduate level course, you're still going to be able to understand and apply these things to your own life. Oh, excuse me. Okay, so I like the language she uses, and even when she does get a little like nerdy with her science, she'll like even call herself out and be like, this is a lot. But she comes back and she describes it in a really simple and effective way about these really vague terms. So, why do I think this book is important for people? Well, first of all, women's sexuality really hasn't been studied or really talked about until pretty recently. So we've been living forever, right? And a lot of these ideas were just kind of put on us about what is normal, what is right, what is wrong, what is healthy, what is not. And we don't really have any real reasons to back those things up. So I really liked her approach where, similar to the work that I do with my clients, is we take like we look at the full puzzle. So we're looking at where do we get these messages from? Because our brain is always telling us and organizing things and determining our behaviors and all this stuff. And so it's like, well, where did we get these things from? We don't just like get born one day and be like, this is all my thoughts on women's sexuality. No, we learn them throughout our life. And where did those things come from? Some of it's pretty obvious with things that we hear from our parents or our family or our friends or our school. Some of it's a little bit more subtle, right? Maybe it's what we see in the movies or in the culture that we grow up in. What I was really fascinated about, and I know not everyone's going to be fascinated about this, was the historical aspect of women's sexuality. I'm pretty good at noticing those other puzzle pieces, but she even takes it a step deeper of like, how sexuality has changed over time and where some of these terms have even like come from. The other thing that I think is really important is she talks a lot about terms relevant to women's sexuality, where I think a lot of us like know them, but again, like we kind of put a definition based on what like typically like the patriarchy has said to us. So she really like dissects a lot of these terms with science and then is like, you can still do whatever like definition you want to do and make sense for you. Like here's like the facts and not just what all these like other subjective puzzle pieces are saying. So she takes um things like desire, arousal, certain biological aspects. There's like so many more things, but of course my brain's blanking right now. I read this like 2 weeks ago. But she talks about these things, and I think we've all heard those terms before and can kind of understand the role of them. But then she really talks about, well, here's the science behind it. Here's what this means. Here's what it doesn't. Here's how sometimes those lines can blur. And while we may be talking about A, we're using the term B, but then that doesn't really apply here. And what happens is for a lot of us, when something kind of goes awry because of a mismatch of what we think like a definition is, or if something isn't matching up to our expectations or someone else's expectations, our brain immediately goes, you are the problem. There's something wrong with you. You're broken. You are good. You are bad. It's like filling in all these things. And so she's able to use these definitions and these cycles and the science to be able to say, hey, we actually didn't know a lot about this stuff a couple years ago. We actually still don't know a lot of stuff, and she even owns up to that. Um, but you're not broken. You're not normal. There's so much variety, but our brains like to organize things. And so she's able to really like slow that down and be like, okay, we use this term over here to kind of describe all these things when really we need multiple terms. And when we have that information, we're able to be like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I thought this was going on, and I thought that I was doing this wrong, or that I was bad for doing this, or this wasn't happening. So I thought maybe this is something that like it's just a me issue. When we have the language of there's actually multiple parts going on, we realize there's nothing wrong with us. We're just trying to like address the wrong puzzle piece. We're trying to like put one of those four puzzle pieces into a spot that has like the three of them. So it's really good language and understanding, okay, I'm normal. I just need to know what is going on for myself and then be able to communicate that possibly if I have a safe partner to talk to, instead of our brain just instantly being like, nope, you're wrong, you're broken, this is all you. So I really like that she tackles a lot of these misconceptions, a lot of myths around stuff, and then gives you just this really empowering language. So that was big fan. She also uses a lot of metaphors, which I'm a big fan of. I know not everyone loves a metaphor, but especially when we're talking about these really vague, science-y terms, I really like a metaphor because it's easier for our brain to like apply it to ourselves. And I know that sounds kind of weird because you're like, well, a metaphor, like, isn't that kind of harder to apply to ourselves? No. Because we're able to really like almost imagine. I'll give you a spoiler for this one. So she uses like a garden metaphor throughout the whole book. She uses a couple other ones, but the garden one is a really like consistent one. And it's really a nice metaphor because even if we're not gardeners ourselves, we can really understand, okay, here's the process of a garden. And we can imagine these plants and we can imagine these things going on. And again, she talks a lot more about it, so I don't want to like spoil it for anyone who wants to read it. But that's a lot easier for us to visualize and kind of see all the steps and the puzzle pieces that it takes to grow a garden versus these really vague terms of like, well, what does my culture think about sexuality? And what do I believe about this stuff? And it also kind of helps like externalize it a little bit so it's not so heavy and personal because some people may have a lot of shame or guilt or talking or thinking about sex might be weird or wrong or different. And so by thinking about a garden, it almost allows us to safely think about these things without our automatic responses kind of like taking over and being like, oh no, we shouldn't think about this stuff. So I really like the metaphor use and her being able to break down these really complicated terms. Okay. So I think I mentioned she talks a lot about shame, which is something that in the clients that I work with and in a lot of my friendships that I have, shame, especially in womanhood, is just so prevalent. And for her, she literally starts talking about shame on page 17. So it's like a forefront of this theme, especially when we're talking about women's sexuality. So I really like that she just like throws that out there in the beginning and really just wants us to feel like what we experience is normal. And she uses a lot of compassion, which I'm a big fan. If you know anything about me, you know I'm like the biggest fan of self-compassion. So to be able to address this guilt and shame in this really gentle, empowering way, just really aligned with the work that I do and the things that I talk with my clients. So like if you're nervous of like, oh, I don't want to be reading this book about sex, like she does this in a really gentle, nurturing way. And I really like the language that she uses. I'm just going through my notes, so I don't like have like a set organize of this. Maybe someday, but I'm really just doing this for fun. Um, she talks a lot about just the language that we use when it comes to sexuality. So I'm a big language person, so I really liked that. Also, us having the correct information. We already talked about that. We talked about the metaphor. Um, I don't want to just like be flipping through this book while you are listening. She also does a really good job of talking about the cycles of sexuality and like our responses. And again, there's so much misconception around this stuff. And we used to think that it was like, this happens, and then this happens, and this happens. And she's able to take these really complicated things and then be able to give us language that I've used with clients already in the past few weeks, and they were like, oh my God, that makes total sense. So a lot of our society, we think of like binary things where it's like one or the other, all or nothing. And she talks a lot about even things like arousal or desire. It can be multiple things going on. It's not like I'm aroused, I'm not aroused, I have desire, I don't have desire. We have almost like these she calls it like a dual model. So we have things that like turn on an accelerator and things that turn on the brake. It's not one or the other. So I really like that language too, because a lot of us are like, we get in our heads and we're like analyzing everything and then we get exhausted and we blame ourselves. And there's like real science that backs up what you're experiencing is super normal. Before I keep going into the notes that I have, I also want to say this book, I believe is for everybody. Not just women, but if you know a woman, like this book is going to be helpful to better understand just what's going on. I work with a lot of women in heterosexual relationships, and I think this would be a really good book for their male partners to read because we see a lot of times sex is one of the biggest stressors in a marriage or a relationship. And there's so much just like miscommunication and mismeaning and all this stuff where this really gives people the language and better understanding what's really going on. So I think one, this book is for everyone, not just if you have the parts that make you a woman. I think everyone can benefit from this. I also think everyone of all like education levels. So while yes, I'm a trained therapist and I've taken sexuality courses before, and I've worked with clients on this. She doesn't make it feel like a textbook. Like, yes, she talks about research, but she talks about it in a way that if you've never read a self-help book before, you'll be able to understand it and apply the stuff to your own life. So she's really good at not using like a lot of what's called jargon, and a lot of like heavy therapy terms or medical terms. She talks about the science of it, and like there's parts where she's like, okay, I gotta kind of like nerd out a little bit here, but she does it in a really good way where I'd say 99% of the book you're gonna be able to understand if you've never taken like a college course before. Like you don't need a master's degree to understand this book, which I think is amazing because and I think she's really passionate as well. I don't want to speak for her, but just I follow her on social media where she also wants to empower people and to share information and make it accessible. And so she's not just writing for these science journals, like she wants the everyday person to be able to better understand their bodies and what's going on. She talks a lot about how sexuality, while it's like maybe like a physical aspect of ourselves, it's also a mental aspect of ourselves. So she talks a lot about our brains and our stress response and just a lot of like self-compassion about how we're thinking about ourselves, how all of that impacts our sexuality, which like afterwards I'm like, oh my gosh, well, duh. And it's something that I talk with my clients about. But again, having this correct language made it so much more like I was missing a few puzzle pieces and I was like, oh my gosh, those were the missing links. Like, thank you. I needed those things. So I really liked that she was very normalizing about what's going on, very validating. And then at each chapter, she kind of gives you something tangible to do. So not only is it like information, which I'm a big fan of, knowledge is power, but also like here's some things that you can try, here's some things that you can do, you can reflect, you can play around with these things, you can have conversations around these things. So it's really like moving us forward. I think a lot of times we think like when we think about women's sexuality, we get stuck and we're in this guilt spiral, shame spiral, anxious, we're just like almost immobilized. And so these exercises or these reflection questions, they almost help us like slowly get out of that and help us move towards closeness and more confidence. So I really like that approach as well. She also does a good job of like, she goes in depth on a lot of these things, and then she like does like a little summary of like, these are the key takeaways. So even if it's like you can't take anything else from this, if anything goes over your head, that's okay. It's like, here are the key takeaways. So I really like that she's really trying to make this as understanding for folks as possible. I think those are the main, yeah, she talks about, there's a few like specific lines that I wanted to share, but of course now I like don't want to be going through my million tabs in front of this, so maybe I will just post them in the comments. And if you end up reading it and have your own quotes that stand out, I would love to hear them. The other thing that I really liked about this book, because of the work that I do a lot of work with stress, anxiety, and trauma. She talks about completing that cycle. So not only is there like a sexual arousal cycle that our bodies can experience, or like arousal cycles that we experience, we also experience stress response cycles. And so when we think about stress and how that impacts our bodies, it makes sense that it's also going to impact sexuality. So I really like the language that she uses of like, we need to take care of our bodies and our stress response and listen to that. And again, she gives tangible things to be able to help you get through that. She talks about the fight or flight response. She talks about freeze response and different things that we can do for our bodies to kind of help move it through that cycle and get back to our baseline. So I really like that language. And I think that that's just, again, helpful for everyone because everyone's going to experience stress at some point in their life and these emotions, and we need to be able to move through that cycle in a helpful way. So we talked about the cycle. She talks about the cycle a lot. She gives some good like stories, which I think are really like we can find and identify parts of ourselves in some of those things or people that we know. She talks about attachment. So again, as a therapist, I'm a big fan of attachment, but she does it in a way where, again, you're not reading like a textbook on attachment, but it's just these different puzzle pieces and these contexts that make sense and how sexuality is so much more complicated than what the mainstream media is portraying it to be. So I like how she talks about attachment. We talked about stress already, the messages we get. And really just, I think my final note is compassion. So I'm a big fan of self-compassion. So I like that she talks about that and really how just like a lot of the ways that we think about ourselves are going to impact our bodies and how our bodies respond to things. So I really liked that approach. She talked about different errors and again, these different complex things. Very normalizing, kind of just repeating myself at this point while I'm just flipping through. But I just really liked the book, and I think it's for everyone. I read this with another therapist actually, and we both really enjoyed it. We've both already recommended it to our clients. So I think this is just something that everyone should read. She does have another book that maybe I'll do a video review on as well, but it's called Burnout. Again, unlocking the secret to unlocking the stress cycle. So she's very into these cycles and completing that. And it's just being able to apply it to women's sexuality. So again, I think everyone should read it. I think it should be a required text in any therapy program, but it's great for the everyday person. And so I got to learn a lot of things just being a woman, but also things that I get to use with a client. So I really enjoyed it. I am recommending it to clients, family members, friends, like literally everyone. But I'm also very like pro talking about sex. So it's okay if you don't recommend it to everyone or talk to a bunch of people about it. So those are my thoughts. I'm probably missing some, so feel free to let's engage in the comments. And if you have your own thoughts on the book, if I find some of those specific quotes that I really like, I will post those in the comments. They'll be spoiler free, so it's not gonna like give anything major away, but just really powerful words because she gave a lot of like gut checks in there, and I was like, oh, big fan of this. But again, I didn't highlight it, and so it's in one of my million tabs that I have. I hope you get to use this book. You can check your local library. You can probably do an ebook, audiobook, whatever makes sense for you to make it accessible. You can follow her on social media. I haven't been to her website personally, but she might have a website. So finding these things, I think is going to just be really helpful in changing the overall message around women's sexuality. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the book, and I'd love to know what books you guys are curious about so you don't have to read them and waste your time if it ends up being a flop. But this one is not a flop. This one I recommend for everyone, so I hope you enjoy it and take care.